Daniel Harper had learned to distrust silence long before he learned to fear it. Every morning began exactly the same way. His eyes opened at precisely 8:17 a.m. without the help of an alarm. The bedroom ceiling greeted him with the same thin crack stretching from one corner to the other, the same ray of sunlight slipping through the curtains, the same distant sound of church bells echoing somewhere beyond the trees. At first it felt comforting, like the predictable rhythm of a peaceful life, but after months of noticing details that never changed, comfort slowly became suspicion. Daniel reached for the clock on his bedside table. 8:17. He picked up his phone. 8:17. The digital clock on the microwave downstairs. 8:17. Even the old grandfather clock in the hallway, which had been broken since childhood according to his wife Emily, displayed the exact same time. He laughed quietly, convincing himself there had to be a logical explanation, perhaps a strange electrical failure, perhaps coincidence, perhaps exhaustion. Yet the feeling refused to leave him. Emily was already making breakfast, humming the same melody she seemed to sing every morning. She smiled as he entered the kitchen, kissed his cheek, and placed a cup of coffee exactly where she always did. "Good morning, sleepyhead," she said with gentle warmth. Daniel smiled back, but his eyes drifted toward the calendar hanging beside the refrigerator. Tuesday, October 14. He frowned. Wasn't yesterday October 14 too? He searched his memory but found only a thick fog where yesterday should have been. Emily noticed his expression and laughed softly. "You're thinking too much again. Eat before your coffee gets cold." Her words sounded ordinary, yet something about the way she said them made Daniel feel as though she had spoken the exact same sentence many times before. He walked outside after breakfast, hoping the fresh autumn air would clear his mind. The town of Ashcroft looked beautiful beneath morning light. Children rode bicycles down quiet streets. Elderly couples watered flower gardens. The mailman waved cheerfully from the opposite sidewalk. Everything appeared so perfectly normal that it almost looked rehearsed. As Daniel crossed the town square, he noticed the old fountain spraying water into the air with flawless precision. A little girl wearing a yellow raincoat sat beside it feeding pigeons. She looked no older than 8. When Daniel smiled at her, she stopped scattering breadcrumbs and stared directly into his eyes with unsettling seriousness. Then she whispered, "You woke up again." Daniel stopped walking. "What did you say?" Before the little girl could answer, a woman rushed over, grabbed her hand, and pulled her away. "Don't bother him, sweetheart," the woman said nervously without looking at Daniel. They disappeared into the crowd within seconds. Daniel stood frozen beside the fountain. Again. Why had she said again? He searched the faces around him, expecting someone else to react. But nobody seemed to notice anything unusual. The pigeons continued pecking at the ground. Cars rolled slowly through the intersection. A street musician played the same soft piano melody Daniel suddenly realized he had heard every morning that week. Or had it been longer than a week? He couldn't remember. Determined to distract himself, Daniel drove toward the neighboring city where he worked as an architect. 15 minutes later, he passed the old gas station outside town. 10 minutes after that, he reached a wooden bridge crossing the river. 5 minutes later, he saw the same gas station again. He frowned and checked the navigation system. The map insisted he was traveling north, yet the scenery had repeated itself perfectly. Daniel turned around and drove south instead. 20 minutes later, he crossed the same bridge for the third time. His pulse quickened. This was impossible. He stopped the car in the middle of the empty road and stepped outside. The surrounding forest stretched endlessly in every direction, silent except for the wind moving through the trees. He looked behind him. The road vanished into thick fog. He looked ahead. More fog. It was as though the highway had been swallowed by something invisible. Suddenly his phone vibrated. Unknown number. Daniel answered immediately. "Hello." Static filled the speaker for several seconds before a weak voice emerged. "Don't let them know you remember." Daniel's heart pounded. "Who is this?" The voice ignored the question. "Whatever you do, don't go to the church at exactly The connection cut off. Daniel stared at the screen. No caller ID remained. No missed call appeared in the history. It was as though the conversation had never happened. As he slowly lowered the phone, he noticed something carved into the wooden guardrail beside the bridge. The words looked old, weathered by years of rain and sunlight. They had clearly been scratched into the wood using a knife. Daniel stepped closer, his breathing growing heavier with every step. The message consisted of only 6 words. "You have read this before, Daniel." Beneath the sentence was a second line written in smaller letters, in handwriting that looked disturbingly familiar. "Run before 8:17 finds you again." Daniel stood motionless beside the bridge as the wind whispered through the trees, his eyes fixed on the carved words that seemed to know him better than he knew himself. His fingers slowly traced the rough grooves in the weathered wood. The cuts were old, perhaps years old, yet the handwriting looked unmistakably like his own. He pulled a pen from his jacket and compared the letters on a receipt in his wallet. The shape of every capital D, every slanted A, every uneven line matched perfectly. His pulse quickened. Someone had either copied his handwriting with impossible precision, or he had carved the message himself, but he had absolutely no memory of ever standing on this bridge before. The sound of an engine interrupted his thoughts. A black pickup truck emerged from the fog and stopped several yards away. The driver lowered the window. It was Sheriff Thomas Keller, a man Daniel had known for almost 10 years. Thomas smiled warmly, yet something about the smile felt rehearsed, almost mechanical. "Everything all right, Daniel? You look like you've seen a ghost." Daniel hesitated before pointing toward the guardrail. "Did you ever notice these words?" Thomas glanced at the carving for less than a second before shrugging. "Teenagers vandalize this bridge every year. Nothing worth worrying about." Daniel frowned. That answer came too quickly. He could have sworn the sheriff hadn't even looked closely enough to read the message. Thomas climbed out of the truck and placed a reassuring hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Emily called me. She said you seemed confused this morning. Stress can do strange things to the mind. Maybe you should head home and get some rest." Daniel stared at him. "I never told Emily I was coming here." The sheriff's smile faded for the briefest moment before returning. "Lucky guess. You're always out driving when you're thinking." Daniel nodded slowly but said nothing. Every instinct told him something was wrong. Thomas returned to his truck and drove away without another word, disappearing into the same thick fog from which he had arrived. Daniel waited until the engine could no longer be heard before climbing back into his own car. This time he ignored the navigation system completely and drove into the forest along a narrow dirt road that wasn't marked on any map. Branches scraped against the windows as the trees grew denser. After nearly 20 minutes, the road ended at an abandoned fire watchtower overlooking the valley. He climbed the rusted staircase, each step groaning beneath his weight. From the top platform he expected to see neighboring towns, distant highways, perhaps even the skyline of the city where he worked. Instead he saw only Ashcroft. The town sat peacefully in the center of the valley, surrounded by endless forest, stretching to every horizon. There were no highways leading away, no neighboring communities, no power lines disappearing into the distance. Nothing. It was as though the entire world ended at the tree line. Daniel raised his phone to take a photograph. The screen suddenly flashed white before displaying a message he had never seen before. "Location unavailable. Outside authorized boundary." His blood ran cold. Outside authorized boundary. Authorized by whom? Before he could think further, another notification appeared. "Battery critically low." He looked at the battery indicator. 100%. The warning vanished almost immediately, replaced by his normal home screen as though nothing had happened. A loud church bell echoed across the valley. Daniel instinctively looked at his watch. 8:17. Impossible. He had left the house more than an hour earlier. He checked his phone. 8:17. The sun hadn't moved. The shadows remained exactly where they had been that morning. Time itself felt frozen. Suddenly every bird in the forest stopped singing at the exact same moment. An unnatural silence spread across the valley. Then, one by one, Every resident visible below in the town square stopped moving. A woman pushing a stroller froze in place. Two children chasing a ball became perfectly still. Cars halted in the middle of the street. Even the water rising from the fountain seemed suspended in midair. Daniel gripped the railing in disbelief. Only one person continued walking, the little girl in the yellow raincoat. She slowly crossed the empty square, while everyone else remained motionless like statues. She looked directly toward the fire tower, despite the enormous distance separating them. Then she raised one small hand and pointed toward the old church standing at the edge of town. At that exact moment, every frozen resident turned their heads simultaneously toward Daniel. Hundreds of faces stared silently from below. None of them blinked. None of them spoke. They simply watched. Daniel stumbled backward, nearly falling from the tower. When he looked again only seconds later, the town had returned to normal. Children laughed. Cars moved through intersections. Birds filled the air once more. The fountain splashed naturally into the basin below. It was as if nothing had happened. Breathing heavily, Daniel hurried down the staircase and raced back to his car. As he opened the driver's door, he noticed a folded piece of paper tucked beneath the windshield wiper. His name was written across the front in familiar handwriting. Inside was a single sentence. "If you found the bridge, you're already too late. Burn this letter before Emily sees it." At the bottom of the page was a small sketch of the old church, and beneath the drawing someone had written 3 chilling words. "She isn't Emily." Daniel Harper stared at the letter until his hands began to shake. The words refused to make sense. She isn't Emily. He looked back toward the church standing alone on the eastern hill, its tall stone bell tower cutting through the gray autumn sky like a warning that had waited years to be heard. He folded the letter carefully instead of burning it and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. If someone wanted him to destroy it, then it was probably the most valuable thing he possessed. As he climbed into his car, he glanced toward the rearview mirror and froze. For a brief second, a man was sitting in the back seat, middle-aged, pale, wearing a dark suit soaked with rainwater. Their eyes met in the mirror. The stranger quietly whispered, "Don't trust the smiles." Daniel spun around instantly. The back seat was empty. He searched every corner of the vehicle before convincing himself it had been another trick of an exhausted mind. Yet the air inside the car suddenly felt several degrees colder. He drove back toward Ashcroft, but this time every familiar street carried an unsettling difference. The bakery displayed exactly the same loaf of bread in its front window as yesterday. The florist arranged the same bouquet in the same vase. Even the elderly man sitting outside the barber shop was reading the same newspaper folded to the same page. Daniel parked beside the town library and walked inside. The old librarian smiled warmly. "Good morning, Daniel. Looking for architecture books again?" Daniel hesitated. "Have I been here recently?" She laughed softly. "You ask me that every Tuesday." The answer struck him harder than he expected. Every Tuesday. He forced a smile and wandered deeper into the building until he reached the local history section. Hundreds of dusty binders documented the town's past. He searched through decades of newspaper archives looking for anything unusual. Floods, fires, murders, missing people. Nothing. Ashcroft appeared almost impossibly peaceful. No major crimes. No accidents. No political scandals. No tragedies of any kind. It was as though the town had existed outside ordinary human history. Then he noticed something stranger. Every newspaper carried the exact same weather forecast. Sunny with scattered clouds, high of 68 degrees, every single day, for nearly 40 years. Daniel frowned and opened another archive. Same forecast. Another year, same forecast. Another decade, still the same. He hurried toward the oldest records, eventually reaching newspapers printed more than 70 years earlier. The same sunshine, the same temperature, the same smiling faces standing in front of the same buildings. His breathing grew heavier. No town on Earth experienced identical weather every day for 70 years. He pulled one photograph from an archive sleeve and looked closely. It showed the annual harvest festival from 32 years earlier. Children ran through the square carrying balloons while families laughed beneath colorful banners. Then Daniel's eyes stopped on a young couple standing near the fountain. The man looked exactly like him. Not similar, identical. Same face. Same scar beneath his chin. Same blue jacket hanging in his own closet at home. Beside him stood Emily wearing the exact same red coat she had worn that very morning. Daniel quickly checked the date beneath the photograph again. October 14, 32 years earlier. His pulse pounded against his temples. This had to be fake. Someone had manipulated the archives. Yet the photograph itself was old. Its edges had yellowed with age. The chemical smell of ancient film still lingered on the paper. Before he could examine it further, a quiet voice spoke behind him. "You finally found it." Daniel turned sharply. The little girl in the yellow raincoat stood alone at the end of the aisle holding a worn stuffed rabbit. She looked at him with calm eyes far older than any child's should be. Daniel knelt to meet her gaze. "Who are you?" She ignored the question. "You shouldn't have looked at the picture. Now they'll know you're remembering faster." Daniel swallowed. "Who will know?" She glanced nervously toward the library entrance before whispering. "The keepers." Daniel frowned. "What are the keepers?" Instead of answering, she reached into the pocket of her raincoat and handed him a small brass key no larger than his thumb. It was old, scratched, and engraved with the number 317. Before Daniel could ask another question, the front door of the library opened. Sheriff Thomas Keller walked inside with two smiling deputies. The little girl immediately stepped backward. Her expression changed from calm to frightened. She whispered one final sentence. "Whatever happens, don't let them take your memories again." Then she ran between the bookshelves and disappeared. Daniel rushed after her, turning the corner only seconds later. The aisle was empty. There was nowhere she could have gone. No doors, no windows, no hiding places. She had simply vanished. Slow footsteps echoed behind him. Sheriff Keller approached with the same gentle smile Daniel had begun to fear. "There you are. Emily's been worried sick." Daniel slipped the brass key into his pocket before the sheriff could notice it. "I'm fine. I just wanted to read." Thomas nodded pleasantly. "Of course." Then his eyes drifted toward the old photograph still lying open on the reading table. For the first time since Daniel had known him, the sheriff's smile disappeared completely. Without saying a word, Thomas picked up the photograph, tore it neatly in half, then into quarters and finally into tiny pieces that floated onto the library floor like dead leaves. "Those old archives are full of printing mistakes," he said quietly. "They only confuse people." Daniel stared at him. That photograph was over 30 years old. Thomas looked directly into his eyes. "No, Daniel. It was taken tomorrow." Before Daniel could respond, every clock inside the library struck 8:17 simultaneously. The lights flickered once. Every reader in the building slowly lowered their books at exactly the same moment. Then, without speaking a single word, every person turned in perfect synchronization and looked directly at Daniel. Their smiles returned, wider than before, almost impossibly wide. And together, in one calm voice that echoed through the silent library, they said, "Welcome back. We were wondering how long this version would last." Daniel Harper's heartbeat echoed louder than the voices surrounding him as dozens of smiling faces remained fixed upon him inside the silent library. No one blinked. No one moved. The words they had spoken together, "Welcome back. We were wondering how long this version would last," repeated endlessly inside his mind. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the moment shattered. A child laughed somewhere near the entrance. Someone coughed. Pages turned. The readers returned to their books as though nothing unusual had happened. Sheriff Thomas Keller smiled politely once more and straightened his jacket. "You look exhausted, Daniel. Maybe it's time to go home." Daniel stared at the people sitting only a few feet away. They behaved perfectly normally again. A young woman quietly studied at a nearby table. An elderly man adjusted his glasses while reading a history book. Two teenagers whispered over a geography atlas. None of them showed the slightest sign that they had just spoken in perfect unison. Daniel slowly stepped backward. He didn't answer the sheriff. He simply walked toward the exit without taking his eyes off the room. Just before reaching the door, he glanced over his shoulder one last time. Every person was still reading, but every pair of eyes was now secretly watching him above the edges of their books. The smiles had returned. Smaller this time, patient, almost compassionate. Daniel pushed through the front doors and hurried across the street without looking back. His breathing remained uneven until he reached his car. Once inside, he locked every door and took the small brass key from his pocket. The number engraved into its surface, 317, seemed strangely familiar. He closed his eyes and tried to remember where he had seen it before. Nothing. Only another thick wall inside his memory. Then he noticed something lying on the passenger seat that definitely hadn't been there earlier. A folded motel receipt. It was yellow with age, its corners curled from moisture. Across the top was printed Pine Creek Motel, room 317. The date made his stomach tighten. October 14. The same date that seemed to haunt every strange event around him. He turned the receipt over. Written on the back in his own handwriting were 6 words. Don't check in, check underneath. Daniel immediately started the engine. Pine Creek Motel sat on the western edge of Ashcroft, a forgotten roadside building that had closed years ago, after the highway was rerouted. At least that was how everyone in town remembered it. 20 minutes later, he stood in front of the abandoned property. The parking lot was empty except for weeds pushing through cracked asphalt. Windows were boarded shut. A faded vacancy sign swung gently in the wind, although there was no breeze. Daniel found room 317 on the second floor. The brass key slid smoothly into the old lock as though it had been waiting for him. The door opened with a long creak. Dust covered every surface. Cobwebs stretched between broken furniture. Yet the room didn't feel abandoned. It felt paused. On the bedside table sat a fresh cup of coffee. Steam still rose from it. Daniel instinctively touched the mug, warm. Someone had been there only moments earlier. A television in the corner suddenly switched on by itself, filling the room with gray static before a grainy videotape image slowly appeared. Daniel nearly dropped the coffee cup. The man on the screen was himself, not someone who looked similar, himself. The recording showed Daniel sitting in the exact same motel room wearing different clothes and looking several years older. Dark circles surrounded his eyes. His beard had grown longer. He stared directly into the camera as though speaking to someone he knew would eventually watch the tape. If you're seeing this, then you ignored my first 3 warnings. That means your memory has already started returning faster than they expected. Daniel's hands trembled. The man on the screen continued. Listen carefully because they'll interrupt this recording within 3 minutes. My name is Daniel Harper, and if you're watching this, then you're me. Not yesterday's me. Not tomorrow's me. You're version 27. Daniel's entire body froze. The older Daniel reached toward the camera and held up a notebook filled with names. 26 versions failed before you. Some trusted Emily. Some trusted the sheriff. One even trusted me. They all disappeared. Daniel whispered to himself. 27. The recording continued. You're wondering what the versions are. I asked the same question. Here's the answer. Every time you get close to remembering the truth, they reset your memories, but they can't erase everything. Small pieces survive. That's why you keep finding messages in your own handwriting. They're from us. From every Daniel who came before. Daniel shook his head in disbelief. No. That's impossible. The older Daniel almost seemed to hear him. I know. I said exactly the same thing. Then I found the room beneath this one. Room beneath. Daniel looked down at the worn wooden floor. The older Daniel leaned closer to the camera. Under the bed there's a trapdoor hidden beneath the carpet. Whatever happens, don't let anyone see you open it. Especially Emily. She isn't trying to hurt you. She's trying to keep you asleep. The recording suddenly flickered. Static filled the screen. Then another face appeared for less than a second. Emily. But she looked terrified, bruised, and crying. Daniel, don't listen to him. Please. He's the reason we're trapped. The image vanished before he could process it. The older Daniel returned, breathing heavily. They're editing the recordings now. You don't have much time. If you find the trapdoor, you'll discover why every version of us keeps leaving messages instead of escaping. Daniel immediately pulled the dusty carpet aside. Beneath it lay an old iron ring attached to a wooden hatch exactly where the recording had described. His heart pounded as he lifted it open. A narrow ladder disappeared into darkness below the motel. He climbed down carefully until his feet touched cold concrete. Flashlight in hand, he looked around. It wasn't a basement. It was a long underground corridor lined with metal doors. Every door carried the same brass number plate. Room 3D17, Room 317, Room 317. Dozens of identical doors stretched endlessly into the darkness. At the very end of the corridor stood a single man with his back turned. Daniel called out cautiously, "Hello." The man slowly turned around. Daniel felt every muscle in his body lock with fear. The stranger wasn't merely similar to him. He was another Daniel Harper. Older by perhaps 20 years, with silver hair, deep scars across his face, and exhausted eyes that carried the weight of countless failures. The older man smiled sadly before speaking the words Daniel least expected to hear. "Don't worry. You're the first version that's actually on time." The older man waited beneath the dim emergency lights without making a single move, as though he had been standing there for years expecting this exact meeting. Daniel Harper remained frozen halfway down the corridor, unable to decide whether he was looking at another person or another impossible trick created by whatever force controlled Ashcroft. Every instinct told him to run, yet curiosity rooted him to the concrete floor. The older man slowly raised both hands to show he carried no weapon. His voice was calm, worn, almost relieved. "You finally made it before they arrived. That's new." Daniel took one cautious step forward. "Who are you?" The man smiled faintly. "I already told you. I'm Daniel Harper." "Just not your Daniel." Daniel shook his head. "That's impossible." The older man nodded. "I know. That's exactly what I said the first time I met myself." Daniel frowned. "The first time." The older version gestured toward one of the identical steel doors lining the corridor. "Come with me. We don't have much time before the keepers notice you've disappeared from the surface." Daniel hesitated only a moment before following him into one of the rooms marked 317. Unlike the abandoned motel above, this room looked like an underground operations center. Maps covered the walls. Hundreds of photographs were connected with red strings. Clocks displayed different dates instead of different time zones. Shelves overflowed with cassette tapes, notebooks, Polaroids, and stacks of hand-drawn maps of Ashcroft. Daniel slowly walked toward the largest wall, where 26 photographs had been pinned in neat rows. Each photograph showed him. Some versions looked younger, others older. One had a broken arm, another wore an eye patch. One smiled confidently. Another looked completely defeated. Every picture carried a handwritten label beneath it. Version 1. Version 2. Version 3. The final photograph was labeled version 26. Beneath it someone had written one sentence in red ink. "Remembered too much." Daniel looked toward the older man. "Which one are you?" The older man answered quietly. "I stopped counting a long time ago." Daniel's breathing became heavier. "This isn't real. None of this is real." The older man nodded with surprising sympathy. "That's exactly why you're dangerous. You're the first version who started doubting reality before they wanted you to." Daniel looked around the room again. "Who are they?" The older man's expression darkened. "The keepers aren't people. They're a system. The people you see in town are only interfaces." Daniel frowned. "Interfaces." Before the older man could explain further, every light in the underground room flickered once. He immediately turned toward the ceiling. "They've noticed. We have maybe 10 minutes. He hurried to an old filing cabinet and removed a thick leather notebook. This belonged to version 11. He got farther than any of us. Daniel opened the notebook. Every page contained detailed observations about Ashcroft. The sun never sets naturally. Birds stop singing exactly 3 seconds before every reset. Nobody in town ever says goodbye. Children remember longer than adults. Mirrors sometimes reflect tomorrow instead of today. Daniel turned another page. The handwriting suddenly became frantic. "Never sleep inside the church. Never answer the phone after 8:17. If Emily cries, Leave immediately. She isn't crying because she's sad. She's crying because the reset is starting. Daniel closed the notebook slowly. Reset. Explain it to me. The older Daniel sat down across from him and spoke with painful honesty. Every time you discover too much, the town rewinds you. Your memories disappear. Everyone else's roles begin again. Emily becomes your wife again. Sheriff Keller becomes your friend again. The librarian forgets everything. Only tiny cracks remain. That's why every version of you keeps leaving clues. We can't remember everything, but we can leave breadcrumbs for the next version. Daniel stared silently. Then one question escaped almost automatically. How long have I been here? The older man looked away. You don't want the answer. Tell me. The older Daniel finally met his eyes. According to the calendars we've managed to keep hidden, you've been trapped in Ashcroft for 43 years. Daniel laughed once, a short, broken laugh filled with disbelief. I'm 34. No. The older man reached into a drawer and removed a faded driver's license. The photograph showed Daniel exactly as he looked today. Date of birth, 1989. Expiration date, 2054. Daniel's hands began shaking uncontrollably. That's fake. Then the older man placed another photograph beside it. This one showed Daniel standing beside Emily outside the church. Snow covered the ground. A small boy stood between them holding both their hands. Daniel stared at the child. Who is that? The older man's eyes filled with sadness. Your son. Daniel looked up sharply. I don't have a son. The older man whispered. Not anymore. Before Daniel could ask another question, footsteps echoed somewhere beyond the corridor. Slow. Deliberate. More than one person. The older Daniel extinguished every lamp in the room. Stay quiet. The footsteps grew louder until several shadows stopped outside the steel door. Then came a familiar voice. Sheriff Keller. Daniel, we know you're in there. Emily is worried about you. No one answered. Another voice joined him. Emily herself. Daniel, please. Come home. You haven't been yourself today. The older Daniel silently shook his head, warning him not to respond. Several long seconds passed. Then Emily spoke again, but this time her voice changed completely. It became flat, emotionless, almost artificial. Subject 27 has exceeded expected memory retention. Authorization requested for immediate reset. Daniel felt his blood freeze. The sheriff answered in the same emotionless tone. Authorization granted. Begin cognitive recovery sequence. Suddenly, every light in the underground corridor turned brilliant white. A deafening alarm echoed through the bunker. The older Daniel grabbed Daniel's arm and pulled him toward a hidden exit at the back of the room. Run. Daniel stumbled after him through a narrow maintenance tunnel. Behind them, heavy steel doors exploded inward as dozens of figures entered the bunker. They all looked like ordinary townspeople. The librarian, the mailman, the florist, the waitress from the diner, the children from the playground. Their faces remained perfectly expressionless as they moved with impossible coordination. Daniel glanced back only once. Every one of them stopped simultaneously and turned toward him with identical smiles. Then they all spoke in perfect unison. Memory restoration initiated. Please stop resisting. The older Daniel shoved open another rusted door leading into the forest outside the motel. Fresh air rushed into the tunnel. For a brief moment, Daniel believed they had escaped. Then he looked up at the night sky. Every star had disappeared. Above Ashcroft hung only a perfectly smooth black ceiling stretching endlessly in every direction. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, enormous cracks began spreading across it like broken glass. The cracks above Ashcroft spread silently across the black sky, fractures racing through a sheet of glass, revealing flashes of blinding white light behind the darkness. Daniel Harper stopped running. Every instinct told him the impossible scene above his head should not exist. Yet the older Daniel grabbed his arm and pulled him deeper into the forest. Don't look up for too long, he warned. It wants you to notice. Daniel tore his eyes away from the sky and followed through dense trees until they reached an abandoned railway tunnel hidden beneath thick vines. The entrance was almost completely concealed by decades of overgrowth, as though nature itself had tried to erase it. The older Daniel pushed aside rusted steel doors and hurried inside. As soon as they crossed the threshold, every strange sound from the forest vanished. The tunnel was unnaturally quiet. No wind, no insects, no distant voices, only the echo of their footsteps. Daniel finally spoke. "What was that in the sky?" The older man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he switched on an old lantern hanging from the tunnel wall. Its warm yellow light revealed faded murals painted along the concrete. Families eating dinner. Children playing. Weddings. Birthdays. Ordinary moments frozen forever beneath layers of dust. Daniel noticed every face in every painting belonged to someone living in Ashcroft today. None of them had aged. The older Daniel beside a faded inscription carved into the wall. "Read it." Daniel brushed away years of dust. The sentence beneath slowly appeared. "If you can see the cracks, the simulation has begun rejecting your mind." Daniel looked back. "Simulation. You keep saying things that don't make sense. Stop speaking in riddles and tell me the truth." The older Daniel sighed deeply. "I wish I knew the truth. I've spent decades chasing it, and every answer creates 3 more questions." Daniel shook his head. "Then tell me what you do know." The older man nodded slowly. "Fair enough." He reached into his coat and unfolded an old map unlike any Daniel had seen before. It showed Ashcroft from above, but the streets formed perfect geometric circles rather than the winding roads Daniel remembered. At the center of the town sat the church. Around it were 8 identical districts labeled Alpha through Theta. Daniel frowned. "This isn't our town." The older Daniel quietly corrected him. "This is what Ashcroft looks like when it isn't pretending." Daniel stared at the map. "What does that mean?" The older man pointed toward the church. "Every road leads here. Every conversation eventually points here. Every reset begins here. Whatever controls this place exists beneath that building." Daniel thought back to the mysterious phone call warning him never to go to the church at exactly 8:17. Who built it? The older Daniel looked away. "I don't know. But I know who tried to destroy it." He walked toward an old wooden cabinet buried beneath fallen debris, and pulled out a stack of burned photographs. The first showed a group of firefighters standing before the church, surrounded by smoke. The date in the corner read October 14. Daniel opened another photograph. The church tower had collapsed. Another. The entire building lay in ruins. Another. It stood perfectly intact again as though nothing had happened. Daniel looked up in confusion. They rebuilt it overnight. The older Daniel slowly shook his head. "No. It reset overnight." Daniel's breathing became heavier. "You're telling me time itself rewinds?" "Not exactly." The older man picked up a small stone from the tunnel floor and dropped it. "Gravity still works. Seasons still change. We age. We age. At least, we used to." He paused before continuing. "It's memory that resets. Reality rearranges itself around whatever story the town wants us to believe." Daniel suddenly remembered the photograph from the library showing him 32 years in the past. If memories can change, how do you know any of this is true? The older Daniel smiled sadly. "I don't. That's the cruelest part. Every theory I've ever believed eventually collapsed. Every certainty became another lie. Then why keep fighting?" The older man's eyes filled with quiet determination. "Because one thing never changes. Every version of us eventually reaches this tunnel. Which means someone wanted us to." Before Daniel could answer, a faint melody drifted through the darkness. Emily's song. The same gentle tune she hummed every morning while making coffee. Daniel instinctively stepped toward the sound. The older Daniel blocked his path. "Don't." Daniel frowned. "She's looking for me." "No. She's looking for the version of you that still trusts her." The melody grew louder. Then Emily appeared at the far end of the tunnel carrying an old lantern. Tears streamed down her face. "Daniel, please come home. I've been searching everywhere." Daniel looked between her and the older version of himself. Emily seemed frightened. Genuine. Human. She took another cautious step forward. "I know you're confused. I know strange things have been happening. But he's lying to you." She pointed directly at the older Daniel. Daniel whispered. "Who is he?" Emily's expression changed. "He's what happens when you refuse to let go." The older Daniel laughed quietly. "That's a clever answer." Emily ignored him. Daniel, ask him one question. Ask him why every version of himself survives while every other version disappears. Daniel slowly turned. The older Daniel remained silent. Emily continued. Go ahead, ask him. Daniel looked directly into his older self's eyes. Why are you still here? Several long seconds passed before the older man finally answered. Because I'm not a previous version. Daniel felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Then who are you? The older man's tired smile disappeared completely. I'm the version that never woke up. Silence consumed the tunnel. Emily closed her eyes as though she had hoped he would never reveal the truth. Daniel stared at the older man in disbelief. None of it made sense. The older Daniel took one slow step forward. 43 years ago, there were two Daniels. One escaped. One stayed behind. I stayed. Daniel whispered, that's impossible. The older man nodded. It should be. But impossible things happen every day in Ashcroft. Emily suddenly shouted. Daniel, don't listen to another word. He's trying to replace you. Before Daniel could react, the lantern in Emily's hand exploded, plunging the tunnel into darkness. At the same instant, dozens of footsteps echoed from every direction, not from one entrance, from every wall surrounding them. Tiny lights began appearing in the darkness. Hundreds of them, like glowing human eyes slowly opening all around the tunnel. Then a calm child's voice echoed through the blackness. The little girl in the yellow raincoat spoke without fear. They found the original. Run. Before they decide which Daniel gets to exist, Daniel Harper's body reacted before his mind could understand what the little girl had just said. He grabbed Emily's wrist with one hand and the older Daniel's arm with the other, pulling both of them deeper into the darkness as hundreds of pale lights drifted toward the tunnel like a living tide. The footsteps behind them remained perfectly synchronized, never speeding up, never slowing down, creating the horrifying illusion that escape was mathematically impossible. The older Daniel suddenly stopped beside a rusted maintenance door and slammed his shoulder into it. The corroded hinges screamed before the heavy metal panel burst open, revealing a narrow service shaft barely large enough for one person. Go, he ordered. Daniel looked at the opening, then back toward Emily. She was staring at the older Daniel with an expression Daniel had never seen before. It wasn't hatred, it was grief. Real grief. Why are you helping him? She whispered. The older Daniel looked at her for several silent seconds before answering. Because this time, he remembered you before the reset. Emily's eyes immediately filled with tears. Daniel froze. What does that mean? Emily slowly turned toward him, her voice trembling. Every cycle you forget me first. Always. You remember your job, your house, the bridge, the church, even the coffee I make every morning. But you never remember the promise you made me. Daniel searched desperately through his memory. Nothing. Emily reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a silver wedding ring hanging from a thin chain. Daniel instinctively touched his own left hand. It was bare. He had never questioned why. Emily smiled through her tears. You used to wear the other one. Every morning after the reset, I put this necklace back on. Because I know you'll ask me where your ring went. Today, you never asked. Daniel's heart tightened painfully. The older Daniel whispered, that's why she's crying. Not because she's afraid. Because this is the first cycle where you're changing. Before Daniel could answer, an unbearable metallic sound echoed through the tunnel. Every glowing eye in the darkness suddenly stopped moving. The silence that followed felt worse than the noise itself. Then one voice spoke. Not from ahead. Not from behind. From everywhere at once. Daniel Harper, return to your designated narrative. Emily immediately grabbed Daniel's arm. Don't answer. No matter what it says, don't answer. The voice continued, calm and almost compassionate. You are experiencing memory contamination. Please remain still while corrections are applied. The tunnel walls began vibrating. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Then Daniel noticed something impossible. The concrete itself was moving. Tiny cracks opened across the walls, revealing thousands of hair-thin black cables hidden beneath the surface. They pulsed like veins beneath living skin. The older Daniel quietly laughed. There it is. Daniel stared in horror. The tunnel isn't real. None of it is. The walls peeled away layer by layer, exposing an endless lattice of machinery stretching far beyond anything that should have existed beneath a small rural town. Massive steel columns disappeared into darkness. Mechanical arms moved silently between glowing towers. Countless transparent tubes carried streams of blue light instead of liquid. Ashcroft wasn't built underground. It was suspended inside something unimaginably larger. Daniel whispered, only one sentence. "How big is this place?" The older Daniel answered without looking away from the machinery. "Bigger than the town, bigger than the valley, maybe bigger than the world you remember." Emily suddenly pointed upward. Daniel looked through the opening where the tunnel ceiling had collapsed. Instead of the night sky, he saw another ceiling, nearly a mile above them. It curved gently in every direction, disappearing beyond the horizon like the inside of a colossal dome. Thousands of tiny lights moved across it with perfect precision. At first, Daniel thought they were stars. Then one of them descended. It wasn't a star. It was an enormous machine, floating silently through the artificial sky. Its smooth, white surface reflected no light, and dozens of long mechanical arms extended beneath it like the legs of a giant spider. Wherever it passed, the cracks in reality sealed themselves closed. Emily stepped backward in terror. "They're deploying custodians." Daniel frowned. "Custodians?" The older Daniel's face darkened. "We don't have much time now. They only appear when someone reaches the edge of the truth." Suddenly, the brass key marked 317 inside Daniel's pocket became almost too hot to touch. He pulled it out instinctively. Strange symbols began glowing across its surface. The older Daniel stared at it in disbelief. "That's never happened before." Daniel looked down. The glowing symbols slowly rearranged themselves into a message. 3 words. "Find observation room." Emily gasped. "No." Daniel looked at her. "You know what that is?" Emily nodded reluctantly. "Nobody is supposed to know it exists." The older Daniel whispered, "That's because if the observation room activates, the simulation can't hide anything anymore." Daniel's breathing quickened. "Simulation? You're saying it again. Tell me exactly what you mean." Before either of them could answer, the floating machine above them suddenly stopped. One of its mechanical arms slowly rotated until it pointed directly at Daniel. A thin beam of brilliant white light shot downward, striking the glowing key in his hand. Instantly, the entire underground complex shuddered. Somewhere far beyond the darkness, enormous alarms began echoing across the unseen structure. Then every voice in Ashcroft, every child, every adult, every stranger Daniel had ever met, spoke simultaneously through hidden speakers that seemed woven into reality itself. "Emergency protocol initiated. Subject Daniel Harper has located the primary observer key. Observation room breach probability exceeds 98%. Wake the architect." The older Daniel's expression completely changed. Fear vanished, replaced by absolute disbelief. He slowly looked at Daniel and whispered words that made every mystery far more terrifying before. "Daniel, I don't think you're the experiment anymore. I think you're the person who built." Daniel Harper could no longer hear the alarms. The words spoken by the older Daniel drowned out everything else. "I don't think you're the experiment anymore. I think you're the person who built it." The sentence echoed inside his mind as the enormous machine suspended beneath the artificial sky slowly descended through the darkness. It moved with terrifying elegance, making no sound despite its impossible size. White light flowed beneath its polished surface, like liquid trapped behind glass. Daniel instinctively stepped backward while still gripping the glowing brass key. The symbols engraved into the metal continued shifting every few seconds, almost as though the key itself were responding to his thoughts. Emily reached for his hand. "Daniel, whatever happens next, don't let it touch you." He looked at her. "You've known about this all along, haven't you?" Emily lowered her eyes. "I remembered pieces. Not everything. Nobody remembers everything. That's how they keep us alive." Daniel frowned. "Alive?" Before she could answer, the older Daniel interrupted. "She's telling the truth. None of us know the complete story. Every cycle they leave us just enough memory to play our roles." Daniel looked from one to the other. "Then why does everyone keep lying to me?" Emily answered quietly. Because every time someone tells you the whole truth, they disappear. Silence followed. Daniel searched her face for deception, but found only exhaustion. Then another memory flashed through his mind without warning. White walls. A hospital corridor. Emily wearing a blue sweater instead of her red coat. Someone laughing. A little boy running toward him with a wooden airplane in his hands. The image lasted less than a second before vanishing. Daniel staggered, clutching his head. Emily immediately caught him before he fell. You remembered Noah. Daniel looked up. Noah. She nodded through tears. Our son. The name struck something buried deep inside him. More fragments exploded into consciousness. A birthday cake, rain against a windshield, the sound of a child calling daddy, a small hand reaching toward him. Then darkness. Daniel gasped for air. I know that voice. Emily smiled sadly. Because it was real. Before another memory could surface, the descending machine stopped directly above them. A circular opening appeared beneath its smooth white shell, revealing a column of brilliant light that reached all the way to the ground. Instead of attacking, the beam projected thousands of floating images around Daniel. At first they looked random. Then he realized they were memories. His memories. Every version of his life surrounded him simultaneously. He saw himself graduating from university, marrying Emily, holding a newborn child, standing in a laboratory wearing a white coat, speaking before hundreds of scientists, sitting alone in a dark office, crying beside a hospital bed. None of the scenes lasted more than a heartbeat before another replaced it. Daniel whispered, "Which one is real?" A calm voice answered from inside the machine. "All of them." Daniel looked upward. "Who are you?" The voice replied without emotion. "Identity designation. Observer 1. Primary cognitive preservation system." Emily grabbed Daniel's arm. "Don't answer its questions. It isn't trying to help you." The machine ignored her. "Daniel Harper, your authorization has been recognized. Observation room access restored after 43 years. The older Daniel stepped backward slowly. 43 years. It keeps saying 43 years. Daniel looked at the machine again. What happened 43 years ago? The voice paused briefly before responding. Catastrophic event 0. Global casualty estimate. 8,126,400,311. Daniel felt every drop of blood leave his face. 8 billion. That wasn't a city. That was the world. Emily whispered, "No, it never told us the number before." Daniel stared upward in disbelief. "You're saying everyone died?" The machine answered with perfect precision. "Biological civilization terminated. Consciousness preservation initiative activated." 12 minutes later, Daniel could barely breathe. The older Daniel closed his eyes. "So that's why we never found another town." There wasn't one. Daniel looked around the enormous artificial structure surrounding Ashcroft. Every impossible building, every hidden machine, every smiling resident, every reset. Suddenly, one terrifying possibility emerged. He forced himself to ask it, "Are these people real?" The machine answered immediately. "Clarification required. Define real." Daniel shouted, "Are they alive?" Several seconds passed. Then came the answer none of them expected. "Yes." Emily's eyes widened. The machine continued. "Human neural patterns successfully preserved before biological extinction. Current environment maintains 743,000 individual consciousnesses across 112 active settlements." Daniel looked around in horror. Ashcroft wasn't the only town. There were more. Hundreds more. Entire civilizations living inside something that should not have existed. The older Daniel whispered, "We've been dead for 43 years. The machine corrected him. "Your biological forms are deceased. Your consciousness remains operational." Emily slowly collapsed onto her knees. Tears streamed silently down her face. Daniel wanted to comfort her, but another question consumed him. Who created all of this? The machine remained silent for several seconds. Then every floating memory surrounding Daniel suddenly merged into one image. A laboratory unlike anything he had ever seen. Scientists rushed through smoke-filled corridors while alarms echoed in the distance. At the center of the room stood one man giving desperate instructions to everyone around him. Daniel stared at the face. It was his own, older than he was now. Gray streaks in his hair, fear in his eyes. He was shouting one sentence over and over. Save the minds, forget the bodies. Save the minds, forget the bodies. Daniel whispered, "That's me." The machine answered, "Correct. Project Architect, Dr. Daniel Harper, founder of the Consciousness Preservation Initiative." Emily looked at Daniel with tears filling her eyes. "You weren't trapped here. You built the place that saved us." Daniel took one unsteady step toward the beam of light. Then another memory surfaced, stronger than all the others. He remembered standing in front of a massive control console as explosions shook the laboratory. Someone had grabbed his arm. Emily. She had been crying. She had begged him not to do it. He had kissed her forehead, smiled, and said 6 words that now echoed through his soul. Someone has to stay behind. Daniel suddenly understood why every version of himself had never escaped. He hadn't been imprisoned. He had volunteered. Before anyone could speak again, the machine projected one final message into the air. Primary architect memory restoration at 96%. Final archive available inside the observation room. Warning: accessing the archive will permanently end the current simulation. Estimated surviving consciousness after transition. Daniel Harper stood beneath the artificial sky of Ashcroft, surrounded by thousands of memories that were not supposed to exist. Every image floating around him represented a piece of a life he had forgotten. A life where he was not a confused architect trapped inside a mysterious town, but the person responsible for creating the entire world around him. The revelation should have brought relief. It should have answered every question. Instead, it created a deeper fear. If he built this place, why did he forget? If he saved everyone, why did he create a system that kept people trapped inside false realities? Daniel slowly looked toward Emily. She had stopped crying. Her expression carried the sadness of someone who had been waiting decades for a person to remember something they desperately wished he could forget. "Tell me the truth," he whispered. "Not another version, not another hidden memory. The real truth." Emily looked at the older Daniel first, then back at him. "The truth is the thing you asked us to hide from you." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "I asked you to hide it." She nodded. "You did. 43 years ago, when the world was ending, you discovered that saving human consciousness was possible. But you also discovered something terrifying. The human mind was never designed to exist without a body." Daniel listened carefully. The first preserved minds began deteriorating. People lost memories. They lost emotions. They forgot loved ones. They forgot who they were. The older Daniel continued. "So you built Ashcroft, a place where memories could regenerate naturally, a place where people could experience ordinary life again." Daniel looked around the fake town. A perfect illusion. Emily shook her head. "No, not perfect. Human. You understood that people didn't need perfection. They needed meaning. They needed challenges. They needed relationships. They needed the feeling that their choices mattered." Daniel looked at the artificial sky above them. "Then why the resets?" The older Daniel answered quietly. "Because you discovered something else. People cannot live forever with the pain of knowing they already lost everything. Every person eventually found out the truth. Some couldn't accept it. Some begged to return to the simulation. Some destroyed themselves trying to wake up. So you created the resets, not as punishment, as mercy." Daniel stepped backward. "No, that isn't mercy. That's a prison." Emily looked at him with heartbreaking honesty. "That's what you thought too. That's why you left yourself a way to escape." Daniel remembered the notebook, the messages, the keys, the warnings. He had been fighting against his own creation. The older Daniel walked toward a steel door hidden behind the machinery. "This leads to the observation room, the place where you stored the original archive, everything you wanted your future self to know." Daniel followed silently. The massive door had no handle, no keypad, no lock, only a small scanner. The brass key in Daniel's hand began glowing again. As he inserted it, the door opened instantly. Inside was not a laboratory, not a machine room. It was a simple office. Warm lights, wooden shelves, a desk covered with papers, a family photograph beside a small wooden airplane. Daniel stopped breathing. It was Noah's toy. The same wooden airplane he remembered from his lost memories. He walked slowly toward the desk and picked it up. His hands trembled. The computer on the desk activated automatically. A video file appeared, created by Daniel Harper. For Daniel Harper, the screen displayed his own face, but this version looked older, exhausted, broken. The recorded Daniel stared directly into the camera. If you're watching this, then the system worked. You remembered enough to reach this room. I need you to understand something before you judge yourself. You didn't create Ashcroft because you wanted control. You created it because you couldn't accept losing them. The recording paused briefly. Then the older Daniel continued. When the final day came, Emily, Noah, and millions of others were dying. The preservation system could only save their consciousness. Their bodies were gone. You had a choice. Let humanity disappear forever, or create a world where they could continue existing. You chose to save them. Daniel stared at the screen, tears forming in his eyes. The recording continued, but there was a cost. To keep memories stable, someone had to become the observer. Someone had to remain connected to every simulation. Someone had to constantly monitor the system. That person was me. Daniel touched the screen. Himself. The recorded Daniel looked away sadly. I knew I would eventually forget. I knew I would eventually become another resident inside my own creation. But I also knew something else. If I remembered everything forever, I would stop being human. I would become a machine managing human lives. So I made the system erase my memories too. The room fell silent. Emily entered behind him. Daniel turned around. Why didn't you tell me? Her eyes filled with tears. Because you made me promise. You said if you ever remembered too early, you would try to shut everything down. Daniel looked back at the screen. The recorded version of himself smiled sadly. There is one final thing you need to know. The reset wasn't created because people couldn't handle the truth. It was created because I couldn't handle the truth. Daniel leaned closer. The video continued. I lost Noah. I lost my world. I lost everything I loved. And I became obsessed with rebuilding what was gone. But eventually I realized something. A copy of life is not the same as life. A memory of happiness is not the same as happiness. The recording ended with one final sentence. The question was never whether we could preserve humanity. The question was whether humanity could still grow inside a memory. The screen went black. Daniel stood motionless. For the first time, he understood the true horror of Ashcroft. It wasn't a prison built by an enemy. It was a paradise built by someone who loved humanity so much that he refused to let it disappear. Yet love had slowly become control. The machine voice suddenly echoed throughout the observation room. Primary architect authorization confirmed. Full system access granted. You may now choose one of two options. Option 1. Maintain simulation indefinitely. 743,000 consciousnesses remain stable. Option 2. Terminate simulation and return all consciousnesses to original reality. Estimated survival probability. Unknown. Daniel stared at the two options appearing on the screen. Emily walked beside him and took his hand. Whatever you choose, don't choose because you're afraid to lose us again. Choose because you believe we deserve a future. The older Daniel looked toward him. For 43 years, every version of you searched for a way out. Maybe you were never supposed to escape. Maybe you were supposed to decide. Daniel looked at the screen. Then something unexpected happened. A third option appeared, one that none of them had seen before. The system displayed a message. Unknown pathway detected. Source, subject Daniel Harper. The older Daniel stepped closer. That's impossible. There was never a option. Daniel stared at the wording slowly. The final message revealed itself. Create a world where no one has to forget. Emily whispered, Daniel, what did you just do? Daniel looked at his own reflection in the dark screen and realized the truth. The system had never been broken. It had been waiting for him to remember one final thing. He was not only the architect of the simulation, he was the person who had designed the way out. And somewhere beyond the artificial sky of Ashcroft, something that had been sleeping for 43 years finally began to. Daniel Harper stared at the third option glowing on the screen, unable to move or speak. Create a world where no one has to forget. The sentence appeared simple, almost impossible, yet it carried a weight that felt heavier than every secret he had uncovered. For 43 years he had believed the greatest challenge was escaping Ashcroft. He had believed the enemy was the system, the machine, the artificial world surrounding him. But standing inside the observation room, surrounded by the memories of every life he had lived, Daniel finally understood the real enemy. It was not the simulation, it was the fear that had created it. He looked at Emily. She was watching him quietly, waiting for the decision but refusing to influence him. That was the difference. For the first time in decades, someone was giving him a choice without trying to guide the outcome. Daniel turned toward the older version of himself. What happens if I choose the third option? The older Daniel looked at the screen with disbelief. I don't know. Daniel almost smiled. You mean after all these years, the person who knows everything doesn't know? The older man shook his head. That's the point. I spent 43 years trying to eliminate uncertainty. You spent your entire life building systems to predict every possible outcome. But the one thing we forgot was that the future only exists because it hasn't happened yet. Emily stepped closer. That's what Noah used to say. Daniel froze. Noah. She smiled sadly. You don't remember that either. He used to ask why adults were always afraid of things they hadn't seen yet. You told him because grown-ups knew how dangerous the world could be. And he told you something you never forgot. Daniel closed his eyes as another memory returned. His son sitting beside the garden, a small wooden airplane in his hands. Daddy, if nobody knows what tomorrow looks like, doesn't that mean tomorrow can still be anything? Daniel opened his eyes. Tears rolled down his face. The machine voice interrupted. Third pathway requires complete system rewrite. Warning: current simulation architecture was designed around memory preservation. New architecture will require emotional adaptation. Probability of failure: 99.8%. The older Daniel looked at him. 99.8%. Daniel nodded slowly. The old me would have stopped there. The older Daniel smiled. And the new you? Daniel looked at Emily. The woman he had married. Lost. Forgotten. Found again. He looked at the empty space where his son's memory had lived for decades. Then he looked at the millions of consciousnesses existing beyond the walls of Ashcroft. People who had lost everything but were still searching for meaning. The new me asks what happens in the other 0.2%. The system remained silent for several seconds. Then it answered. A possibility exists. Daniel stepped toward the control panel. Begin rewrite. Immediately the entire structure began shaking. The artificial sky of Ashcroft cracked open completely, revealing the enormous preservation facility surrounding them. Thousands of other simulated worlds became visible in the distance. Some looked like cities. Others looked like villages. Some appeared frozen in different time periods. Every one of them contained millions of people who believed their reality was the only one. Alarms erupted throughout the facility. Warning: memory architecture destabilizing. Warning: consciousness synchronization failure. Warning: administrator emotional influence detected. The older Daniel grabbed the railing as the entire room shifted. What did you do? Daniel stared at the screens. I stopped controlling them. The older man looked confused. Then what keeps the system running? Daniel smiled faintly. Them. Across every simulation, small changes began occurring. In one city, a woman suddenly remembered a childhood friend she thought was forgotten. In another world, a man looked at the sky and questioned why he had never wondered about the stars. In another town, a child asked a question that nobody had ever asked before. The simulations were changing, not collapsing, growing. The machine voice returned, but this time something was different. The cold precision was gone, new data forming, unexpected emotional patterns detected. Curiosity, hope, attachment. The older Daniel stared at the screens. You're teaching the system. Daniel shook his head. No, I'm reminding it. Reminding it of what? Daniel looked at the endless worlds beyond them. That humans were never meant to be preserved like photographs. We were meant to change. The machine processed the statement. Then it asked a question, a real question. Not a command. Not a calculation. Why? Everyone inside the room became silent. The AI had never asked why before. It had always asked how. How to preserve. How to predict. How to control. But never why. Daniel answered softly. Because a perfect world without change is just another kind of death. For several moments nothing happened. Then every screen across the facility displayed the same message. Initializing Humanity 2.0. Emily looked at Daniel. Is that safe? Daniel smiled slightly. No. She laughed through her tears. At least you're honest now. He took her hand. The world around them began transforming. The artificial buildings of Ashcroft faded away, replaced by open fields beneath a real sky. The perfect weather disappeared. Clouds moved naturally. Wind changed direction unpredictably. For the first time in 43 years, rain began falling. Real rain. People across the town stepped outside confused. Some looked afraid. Some looked amazed. Some simply stood there crying because they remembered what rain felt like. The little girl in the yellow raincoat appeared beside the fountain. She looked up at Daniel and smiled. You finally woke up. Daniel smiled back. Who are you? The girl looked toward the sky. Someone who was waiting for you to understand. Then she ran away into the rain. Daniel watched her disappear. Emily stood beside him. Do you think we'll remember everything? Daniel looked toward the horizon. Maybe not. But maybe that's okay. They walked together through the rain as the new world slowly began. Months later, humanity discovered the truth. They had not returned to the old Earth. That world was gone forever. But they had been given something else. A chance. The preservation facility became the foundation of a new civilization where artificial intelligence no longer controlled human choices, but helped humans explore possibilities. The system that once predicted every decision became a tool for discovery. It learned from humanity instead of trying to replace it. Daniel never recovered every memory from his old life. Some moments remained lost forever. The sound of Noah's ladder. The exact words of his wedding vows. The final conversation with his family before the end of the world. But he stopped chasing every lost piece. Because he finally understood something he had forgotten when he created Ashcroft. A life is not valuable because we remember every second of it. A life is valuable because we continue creating new seconds worth remembering. Years later, an old man walked through a field beneath a changing sky. Beside him walked Emily, older now, holding his hand. Their grandchildren played nearby, laughing without fear of resets, without fear of forgetting. One child looked up and asked him a simple question. Grandpa, what was the old world like? Daniel smiled and looked toward the endless horizon. He thought about the cities that disappeared, the people who were gone, the machine that almost became humanity's replacement. Then he answered, it was beautiful, it was broken, it was imperfect. And that's what made it worth saving. The child smiled and ran back toward the others. Daniel watched the sunset, knowing the future was uncertain, knowing tomorrow could bring problems they couldn't predict, knowing humanity would make mistakes again. But for the first time in 43 years, he welcomed the unknown, because uncertainty was not the enemy. It was proof that life was still moving forward. And somewhere deep inside the system that once controlled every possibility, one final message remained hidden. Not a command. Not a prediction. Just 3 simple words. Let them cool.